To keep your own P4500i running optimally at elevations between 2,000 and 7,000 feet, a high-altitude carburetor kit may be necessary. Follow the precautions in your owner's manual when servicing your generator. For safety purposes, remove the battery access panel and disconnect the battery from the unit. Now we're going to remove the left side maintenance panel using a 10mm socket and a Phillips screwdriver. Remove the bolt on the bottom left corner and loosen all of the screws to allow for removal of the panel. For safety reasons, we're also going to remove the boot from the spark plug. Make sure the fuel valve is in the off position and remove the screws holding the panel. There are 4 screws in the face and 2 screws on either side. Remove the screws and just let the panel hang loosely. Remove the drain tube from inside the case. Place it in a suitable container using a flat-headed screwdriver. Loosen the screw at the carburetor drain. Let it drain completely and properly dispose of the fuel. Now we need to remove the 2 bolts in the air box mounted to the carburetor. Remove the 2 bolts. Sometimes it may be easier to go through the front panel. Once the bolts are removed, remove the lid and the foam element inside. Remove the clamp from the vapor tube. Slide it aside. Remove the vapor tube and the crankcase breather. Using a ratchet with a 10mm socket, remove the 2 nuts that hold the box base to the carburetor itself. Again, sometimes it's easier to go through the front panel to access some of these components. Remove the nuts from the studs, slide the airbox base off. Remove the gasket from the face of the carburetor and make sure the carburetor is loose from the insulator. Reach in and disconnect the electrical connectors. One of the connectors is fairly simple to get to. It's right behind the panel. The other connector is a little trickier. If you're coming through the face, it's on the bottom right. It's connected to the starting module right there as seen in the picture. Once all the connectors are disconnected, slide the carburetor off the studs. Make sure that all the wiring is free. And turn the carburetor so you can access the clamp on the fuel line. Again, having that front access panel loose is a big help here. Slide the fuel line clamp off the carburetor. And remove the fuel hose from the carburetor and bring the carburetor out. Now that the carburetor is removed, we need to select the appropriate jet from our jet kit. So the jet kit contains 4 different jets for 4 different altitude ranges. So select the jet that's most appropriate for your operating conditions. The jet kit comes with jets and gaskets, so replace any gaskets as you go. To begin, take your ratchet or a 10mm wrench and break loose the bolt at the bottom of the float ball and remove the bolt and the float ball. Take a flat screwdriver and remove the main jet. Make sure you have the appropriate screwdriver, as you can easily damage the brass jets. Once it's loose, jet will fall out, along with the emulsion tube. Now notice the emulsion tube has a distinct shape to it, and the small end in the ridge will face up. So when you're putting that in the carburetor, slide it in like so. It only fits one way. Attempting to put it in wrong could damage the carburetor body. So take the jet that you've selected and remove it from the bag. Make sure that the slot for the flathead screwdriver is facing out when you reinstall the jet. Slide the jet into the hole and snug it back up. Tighten the jet to make sure it doesn't vibrate loose. Reinstall the float bowl gasket. There's a groove in the carburetor body that aligns with. Set the float bowl back on the carburetor body. Keep in mind where the drain screw points on this unit. You want to be able to access that once it's installed in the unit. So reinstall the screw for the float bowl. Index the drain screw and tighten the bolt back up. Once that's tight, that's it. The carburetor is rejetted. Installation of the carburetor is the reverse of the removal. So make sure that the insulator is on and the gasket is in good shape, or replace the gasket if needed. Slide the carburetor in sideways. I like to come through the front panel and reinstall the fuel line onto the carburetor. You may need to use a pair of pliers here to reinstall the clamp. I was able to slide it on with my thumb. Once the fuel line's in place, slide the carburetor onto the studs. Take and reroute your wiring above the motor, and there's a little P-clip there below the fuel tank you'll see. If you paid close attention to the wire routing as you disassemble the unit, there should be no problem. Again, reaching in through the front panel, there's one clip right behind the panel and one wire connector in the starting module on the bottom right. Once those are connected, you can kind of slide the front control panel back in place, which will allow you to slide the carburetor back onto the studs fully. Slide our gasket back in place. Now the airbox base. Slip the airbox base into the tube first, and then slip it onto the studs. Reinstall our 10mm nuts. It's always best to start these by hand if you can, and then snug them up with the ratchet. Once the base is in place, reconnect the vapor tube and the clamp. The crankcase breather needs to be reinstalled now. Now this is the point I like to check for leaks. At this point I usually turn the fuel valve on, wait a few seconds, make sure I don't have any fuel leaking. I don't want to continue reassembling this unit and have fuel leaking in it, so I like to check it now while it's open and I can see everything. Since there's no fuel leaking, I'm going to continue reassembling the unit. Slide the foam element into the air box. Set the lid in place. I need to get my 2 bolts back in the lid. Again, coming through that front panel makes a world of difference. Take your ratchet, snug it back up, slide the front panel back up in place. Take my Phillips screwdriver, put the 4 screws back in the face, and 2 on each side. Make sure the drain tube's back in place in the case. Replace your spark plug boot. Take the maintenance panel, align the tabs in the base, slide it up into the grommet. Four Phillips screws get tightened, and the bolt in the bottom left corner gets driven in with a 10mm socket. Now to the rear of the unit, we're going to reconnect the battery connector and reinstall the battery access panel. And that's it. Take your unit out to a well-ventilated area. Test the unit for function. If your carburetor is jetted for high altitude operation, be very cautious about operating at low altitudes as your generator will be too lean. Running the generator lean could cause potential engine damage.